"Who are you and why are you in my house?" I roared, my voice shaking the air at the stranger live streaming from my bedroom. She calmly explained. She was an HOA president conducting security education and had been living in my cabin for 2 weeks while I was away. Then she told me I was trespassing on my own property. When the cops arrived, they actually agreed with her. My tongue turned to stone, words lost in the storm of my mind as my entire world flipped upside down. Comment where you're watching because this story will shock you. Picture this. You come home early from a work trip, expecting to surprise yourself with a quiet weekend at your late wife's cabin. Instead, you walk into what can only be described as a complete nightmare. That's exactly what happened to me 3 months ago. And honestly, I'm still processing the absolute insanity of it all. My name is Daniel Hayes. I'm 45 years old and I'm about to tell you a story that'll make you question everything you think you know about trust, grief, and the length some people will go for money. Laura, my wife, died 8 months ago from a heart attack right here in our master bedroom. This cabin in the Colorado mountains was where I proposed to her, where we spent our happiest moments, and where I thought I'd heal from losing her. I inherited it from my grandfather, and after Laura passed, it became my sanctuary. Every morning, I still set 2 coffee cups out of habit. I talk to her photo like she's still here because honestly, some days that's the only thing keeping me sane. Working as an IT security consultant gives me the flexibility to work remotely. So, I figured this place would be perfect for processing my grief while staying connected to her memory. I've been in Denver for 2 weeks working on a big security consultation project, and I decided to come back a day early because I was feeling particularly lonely. The drive up the mountain that Friday afternoon was gorgeous. October in Colorado is just magical with all the aspen trees turning gold. I was actually feeling optimistic for the first time in months, thinking maybe I was finally ready to start healing properly. Man, was I wrong about that. When I pulled into the driveway around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I noticed the lights were on inside, which sent a shiver of unease down my spine because I always turn everything off when I leave. As I got closer to the door, I heard something that froze the very marrow in my bones. A woman's voice saying, "Okay, everyone. The bidding starts at $50 for this gorgeous vintage wedding ring." I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, and unlocked the door as quietly as possible. What I saw when I stepped inside will haunt me for the rest of my life. There was a woman I'd never seen before, blonde, probably in her early 50s, wearing what I immediately recognized as Laura's favorite black dress, standing in my living room with her phone pointed at herself, live streaming to what appeared to be thousands of viewers. She was holding up Laura's wedding ring, the one I'd placed back on her finger when the funeral home prepared her body. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was seeing Laura's memorial corner completely destroyed. Her ashes urn was gone from the mantel. Her photos were scattered on the floor like trash. And there was some random guy walking out of my bedroom with nothing but a towel. "I'm sorry. What the hell is going on here?" I thundered, fury ripping through my chest, dropping my bag and startling both of them. The guy in the towel mumbled something about getting dressed and disappeared back into the bedroom. While this woman, who I later learned was named Samantha Green, had the audacity to hold up one finger like she was asking me to wait while she finished her live stream. "Hold on, everyone. We have a little interruption here," she said to her phone with this sickeningly sweet smile. As you can see, this is exactly why property security education is so important. Homeowners who don't properly secure their properties create these awkward situations. I stood there for a solid 10 seconds, mouth hanging open, trying to process what she just said. Property security education. Was this woman seriously suggesting that I was the problem here? Turn that thing off right now and get out of my house. I growled through clenched teeth, trying to keep my voice steady even though I was shaking with rage. That ring belonged to my wife, who died 8 months ago, and you have absolutely no right to be here. Erin fixed her gaze on me with chilling calm, with the smugness of a queen on stolen throne, and reached into a designer purse, pulling out what looked like official documents with fancy letterhead. "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down. I'm Samantha Green, president of the Property Security Education Initiative, and I have full authorization to conduct this security assessment of your abandoned property. As you can see here, this property was flagged for abandonment after being unoccupied for over 2 weeks without proper notification to the Homeowners Association. I'm live streaming the security test to educate my 45,000 followers about the importance of proper property protection." The confidence in her voice rang out like poisoned honey, absolutely chilling. She genuinely seemed to believe that what she was doing was not only legal but educational. That's when I heard a car door slam outside, and within seconds there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, I was relieved to see a police officer standing there. Officer Delgado looked to be in his mid-40s, Hispanic with the kind of mustache that screamed 1980s throwback. What sent a shiver of unease down my spine though was that he was holding his phone up like he was filming himself. "Hey everyone, Officer Delgado here responding to a disturbance call," he said to his phone before looking at me. "Sir, we got a report of someone threatening a property security expert. Officer, this woman broke into my house and is selling my dead wife's jewelry on the internet. I need her arrested immediately." Torres looked back and forth between me and Erin, who was still live streaming and had somehow managed to position herself as the victim in this scenario. Erin immediately launched into her spiel about property security education and homeowner negligence, showing Torres the same fake documents she'd shown me. What disturbed me was how seriously he seemed to be taking her story, even asking about her follower count if that gave her some kind of credibility. I showed Torres my driver's license with this address, explained that my grandfather had left me the property, told him about Laura's death and how this was where we lived together. But Erin had an answer for everything, presenting herself as someone who was actually helping negligent homeowners by exposing their security vulnerabilities. Torres seemed more impressed by her professional presentation than concerned about the obvious theft happening right in front of him. That's when I heard another car in the driveway and Chloe Bennett walked in carrying a tray with coffee cups. She owned the coffee shop about 10 minutes down the mountain road and had this genuinely concerned expression on her face. "Oh my goodness, Tim. What's happening here? Are you alright?" Her timing was absolutely perfect, exactly when I needed someone who could vouch for me and help make sense of this insane situation. Madison was about my age with dark hair and kind eyes that reminded me a little of Laura. I'd gotten coffee from her shop a few times since moving up here full-time, and she'd always been incredibly sweet about checking on me during the worst of my grief. Madison immediately went into protective mode, offering me coffee and telling Torres that she'd known Laura and me for months, that this was definitely our home, and that Erin was clearly taking advantage of my grief. She even mentioned that Laura had shown her where we kept the spare key, which was true. Laura had done that when she was getting sicker and wanted to make sure someone could check on her if I was working late. Her testimony seemed to carry weight with Torres in a way that my own documentation hadn't. Torres wore the mask of false authority enough to ask Erin to step outside for a private conversation. While they talked on the front porch, Madison stayed with me and helped me start collecting Laura's scattered photos from the floor. "Tim, I'm so sorry this is happening to you," she said quietly. "Some people have no respect for grief or loss. We'll get through this together, okay?" Her kindness in that moment was exactly what I needed. After 8 months of dealing with everything alone, having someone show up and offer genuine support felt like a miracle. When Torres came back inside, he looked tired and annoyed. "Mr. Scott, this appears to be a civil matter between you and the Homeowners Association. Miss Campbell has what appear to be legitimate documents authorizing her presence here, but you clearly have proof of ownership. I'm recommending you both work this out through proper legal channels rather than involving law enforcement in what's essentially a property dispute." Erin packed up her live streaming equipment with this predatory grin that reeked of victory on her, like she'd won some kind of victory, and left with her male companion without another word. After they left, Madison and I sat on the couch trying to process what had just happened. "Where are Laura's ashes?" I asked, suddenly realizing that the urn was still missing from the memorial corner. Madison helped me search the entire house and we couldn't find it anywhere. That's when it hit me. I had something Aaron didn't know about. 6 months ago, after a couple of break-in attempts in the area, I'd installed a security system with 7 cameras. 6 of them were pretty obvious, the kind any criminal would spot and disable. But the 7th one was built into the smoke detector above the fireplace, hardwired into the house's electrical system with no wireless signature that could be 916 detected. "Madison," I growled through clenched teeth, pulling up the camera app on my phone. "I think we're about to find out what really happened here." As the footage started loading from the past 2 weeks, my veins carried both fire and ice. The first few clips showed Aaron arriving with multiple men, setting up what looked like a temporary living situation. But when I fast-forwarded to day 4 of my absence, I watched in absolute horror as Aaron casually carried Laura's ashes urn out to the dumpster behind the house like it was garbage, then returned to the cabin and continued her live stream as if nothing had happened. Madison gasped and covered her mouth when she saw the footage. "Oh my God, Tim. She just threw Laura away like trash. Who does that? What kind of monster treats someone's remains like garbage?" I was struck numb, my spirit hollowed out to respond immediately. Watching my wife's ashes being discarded so casually was like experiencing her death all over again. Except this time it was intentional cruelty rather than natural tragedy. But there was something else in the footage that caught my attention. Something that made me realize this wasn't just a random crime of opportunity. But when I checked the hidden camera footage from that smoke detector, what I saw Aaron doing with my wife's ashes made me realize this wasn't just theft. It was something much, much darker. Madison and I spent the next several hours going through 2 weeks' worth of hidden camera footage. And what we discovered was a level of sick, twisted entrepreneurship that I didn't even know existed. This wasn't some desperate woman who'd broken into my cabin looking for things to steal. This was a sophisticated business operation that had been planned for months with my dead wife's memory as the primary product being sold. Starting from day 1 of my Denver trip, Aaron had moved into the cabin like she owned the place, bringing in a rotating cast of men and treating my home like her personal love nest. But that was just the surface level. The real horror was discovering that she'd listed Laura's bedroom, the actual bed where my wife died, on vacation rental websites as something called Angel's Memory Room, Authentic Grief Experience. The listing charged $400 per night for people to sleep in Laura's deathbed, marketed it as a spiritual connection with deceased energy and an authentic grief processing opportunity. The vacation rental listing was professionally photographed and written with pseudo-spiritual marketing copy that made me physically sick to read. Experience the profound energy of transition in this sacred space where a beloved wife spent her final earthly moments. Guests report feeling a deep spiritual connection and sense of peace that can only come from sleeping where love conquered death. Includes access to the memorial garden and personal effects for authentic grief processing. She was literally selling Laura's death as a tourist attraction, complete with 5-star reviews from people who'd paid premium prices to sleep in my wife's deathbed. But here's where it gets really twisted. Every single review was fake. Madison and I spent an hour going through them, and they were all variations of the same nauseating theme. Written by accounts that had been created within the past 6 months. All with stolen profile photos that we traced back to obituary websites and memorial pages. Life-changing experience that helped me process my own grief. Felt Laura's presence throughout the night. Truly healing. The energy in this room is unlike anything I've ever experienced. The fake reviews were more disturbing than the scam itself because they showed how much effort Aaron had put into creating a believable lie. The financial scope of this operation was staggering. In just 2 weeks, Aaron had collected $3,200 from fake vacation rental bookings. Even though no actual customers had stayed there, she was essentially running a phantom business, collecting money for services that didn't exist while using the fake bookings as justification for occupying my property. The bookings served dual purposes. They generated immediate revenue and provided fake legitimacy for her presence in the cabin. If anyone questioned her authority to be there, Madison helped me document everything, taking screenshots and writing down timestamps while I tried to keep my emotions in check. "Tim, this isn't just trespassing anymore. This is organized fraud," she said after we'd been through about half the footage. "She's got fake business documentation, fake customer reviews, fake rental bookings. This is a professional operation." She was absolutely right. And it was terrifying to think about how many other people might be getting scammed by the same system. But the vacation rental scam was just one revenue stream. Erin was also selling Laura's belongings piece by piece during her daily live streams, turning my wife's possessions into content for her property security education show. I watched in horror as she held up Laura's favorite coffee mug, the one with a chip on the handle that she refused to throw away because it was from our honeymoon, and auctioned it off to her followers for $85. She sold Laura's reading glasses, her bookmark collection, and even her meditation cushion. Everything had a price and a fabricated story attached. The live stream revenue was even more sophisticated than the rental scam. Erin had built a community of 45,000 followers who thought they were learning valuable home security lessons by watching her educational demonstrations. She'd hold up pieces of Laura's jewelry or clothing and discuss their sentimental value that careless homeowners leave vulnerable to loss. Her followers would donate money, buy merchandise, and bid on items, all while thinking they were supporting legitimate educational content about property protection. What made it even more disgusting was watching Erin perform grief for her audience. She'd put on Laura's clothes and talk about the emotional attachment homeowners develop to properties while wearing my dead wife's wedding dress. She'd read entries from Laura's personal diary out loud for educational purposes, about the psychological vulnerabilities that make homeowners easy targets. She was monetizing my wife's private thoughts about her illness, her fears about dying, her hopes that I'd be okay after she was gone. Madison's reaction to all this felt genuine and appropriate. She'd get angry on my behalf when we saw particularly egregious violations, offer comfort when I got overwhelmed by the emotional impact, and ask smart questions about the technical aspects of the scam. "How did she know you'd be gone for exactly 2 weeks?" Madison asked. "And how did she get access to your property so quickly?" This level of preparation suggests she'd been watching you for a while before you left town. That's when we decided to check on Ethan Moore, my neighbor, who lived about 4 mile down the road. Madison suggested that maybe he'd seen something suspicious over the past 2 weeks. Or maybe Erin had approached him with some story to explain why she was at my property. It seemed like a logical next step. So, we walked over to Ethan Moore's place to see what he might know about the situation. Ethan Moore's behavior was immediately suspicious. He was outside taking detailed photographs of properties in the area, including my cabin, which he tried to explain as documenting potential improvements for insurance purposes. But when I asked if he'd seen anything strange at my place over the past couple of weeks, he made a slip that revealed more than he'd intended. "I mean, I saw some activity over there, but I figured it was just the property management company doing their thing." Property management company? I'd never hired any property management company, and I told Ethan Moore that immediately. He realized his mistake and started backtracking, saying he'd probably confused my place with someone else's, that he didn't really remember the details, but the damage was done. Clearly, Erin had fed him some story about being authorized to manage my property, and he'd accepted it without question. Madison pressed him for more details and eventually he admitted that a professional-look woman had approached him weeks earlier with official documentation about temporary property management services for grieving homeowners. When we got back to my cabin, Madison made an observation that chilled me to the bone. "Tim, look at these timestamps again. She didn't just randomly choose your property. She knew exactly when you'd be leaving and for how long. Someone gave her inside information about your schedule." She was right. The camera footage showed Erin arriving at my cabin within hours of my departure for Denver, already equipped with everything she needed for a 2-week occupation. This wasn't an opportunistic crime. This was carefully planned exploitation. We continued going through the footage, and that's when I noticed something about Madison's visits to my cabin that I hadn't remembered clearly. According to the camera timestamps, she'd been coming to my property regularly throughout the 8 months since Laura's death, 47 visits total. That seemed like a lot for someone I'd only gotten coffee from Occasionally, but Madison explained that she'd been worried about me and wanted to check on my well-being during the worst of my grief. "Laura mentioned you to me before she died," Madison said when I asked about the frequency of her visits. "She was concerned about how you'd cope alone and asked me to keep an eye on you. I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but I didn't want to add to your emotional burden by talking about Laura's worries." That seemed reasonable and I was grateful for her concern, but something about the timing bothered me. Laura had only been sick for the last few months of her life, and I didn't remember her mentioning Madison specifically. The camera footage also showed that Madison always seemed to know exactly when to visit. She'd arrive right after I'd had particularly difficult days, or when I was dealing with legal paperwork related to Laura's death, or when I was struggling with insomnia and staying up all night. Her timing was uncannily perfect, like she had some kind of sixth sense about my emotional state. But then again, small mountain communities are tight-knit, and maybe word got around. When the local widower hour was having a rough time. As we wrapped up our evidence review session, Madison offered to help me contact law enforcement agencies that might be better equipped to handle this kind of fraud. Officer Delgado had been. "This is clearly beyond local police capabilities," she said. "We need investigators who specialize in organized fraud and identity theft." Her suggestion made sense, and I appreciated having someone who could think strategically about next steps while I was still processing the emotional trauma of watching my wife's memory being systematically violated. But there was one detail from the camera footage that kept nagging at me. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The timing of Madison's 47 visits didn't just coincide with my difficult days. It coincided with my entire timeline since Laura's death. The first recorded visit was just days after Laura's funeral, which meant Madison had been monitoring my property and my emotional state from the very beginning of my grief process. For someone who claimed that Laura had asked her to watch out for me, she seemed to have started that monitoring awfully quickly after Laura's death. Madison's coffee loyalty card showed 47 visits in just 8 months. But Laura had only been dead for 8 months. So, why was Madison watching our house before my wife even died? The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with grief. Something about Madison's explanation regarding Laura asking her to watch out for me kept replaying in my mind. Laura had been sick for months before her heart attack, but she'd never mentioned anyone named Madison to me. Given how worried I'd been about her social isolation during her illness, any new friendship would have been huge news that I'd definitely have celebrated and remembered. I decided to drive down to Ethan Moore's place again, this time alone to get a clearer picture of what he actually knew about Aaron's operation. When I arrived, Ethan Moore was outside again with his camera, but this time he was taking pictures of my property from his driveway. The angle and distance were perfect for documenting who was coming and going, when lights were on or off, and whether cars were parked there overnight. "Morning, Ethan Moore," I called out, walking up his driveway with my hands visible and my tone friendly. "Mind if we talk about what you actually saw at my place?" Ethan Moore looked like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't have, quickly lowering his camera and mumbling something about bird watching. But there was a manila folder on the hood of his truck filled with professional property photographs, including detailed shots of my cabin from every angle, close-ups of doors and windows, and even the exact location of the spare key hiding spot that Laura had shown Madison. These weren't casual neighbor observations. This was a comprehensive property assessment. "Ethan Moore, what the hell is this?" I asked, picking up one of the photos. "Are you working with Aaron?" His face went through about 15 different expressions before settling on resigned guilt. "Tim, I swear I had no idea what she was really doing. She hired me to do a property appraisal, saying she was working with a property management company that specialized in helping grieving homeowners. She paid me $800 and told me it was all legitimate work." That explained his weird behavior and defensiveness. Ethan Moore wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was just a real estate appraiser who had been hired to do what he thought was legitimate work. He showed me the contract Aaron had given him, and it was a masterpiece of professional look fraud. The letterhead belonged to something called Mountain Memory Management Services with a Denver address, phone number, and website. The Contract outline services for recently bereaved property owners who need temporary assistance managing memorial properties during the grieving process. She told me you were overwhelmed with grief and had asked her company to help manage the property while you got your life together. Ethan Moore continued. She had professional-look contracts, business cards, even fake testimonials from supposed previous clients. If I'd been in your position, I probably would have fallen for it, too. The only way to verify it was all fake would have been to actually call the state licensing board. And who thinks to do that when someone approaches you with what seems like legitimate business? When I got back to my cabin, Madison was there waiting for me with fresh coffee and a concerned expression. As I explained about Ethan Moore's involvement in the property appraisal scam, I found myself studying Madison's face more carefully than I ever had before. She'd been incredibly supportive during my grief, always knowing exactly what to say and when to visit. But now that I was really paying attention, there was something almost practiced about her compassion. Like she'd done this before, like comforting grieving widowers was a skill she had developed rather than a natural instinct. But as I was talking, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Madison was wearing a ring I'd never seen before. A simple gold band with a small diamond that looked remarkably similar to no, it couldn't be. But the more I looked at it, the more certain I became. It was Laura's engagement ring, the one she'd worn every day for 7 years until the swelling from her medication made it impossible to keep on. She'd put it in our bedroom jewelry box about 3 months before she died. Madison, I growled through clenched teeth, trying to keep my voice steady. That's a beautiful ring. Where did you get it? She looked down at her hand like she'd forgotten she was wearing it. And for just a split second, I saw something flicker across her face. Panic, maybe, or calculation. Oh, this old thing. I've had it for years. It belonged to my grandmother. But her voice had a quality I'd never heard before. Almost like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed, but never expected to need. The problem was, I knew that ring intimately. Laura had shown me the tiny inscription inside the band. Forever and OSD that her first boyfriend had put there when she was 19. She had been embarrassed about it but couldn't afford to get it removed. So, it had become this private joke between us about her romantic history. Mind if I take a look? I asked casually. I'm kind of a jewelry nerd since Laura collected vintage pieces. Madison's entire body language changed. She pulled her hand back protectively and started talking quickly about how the ring was too fragile for handling, how it was a family heirloom she couldn't risk damaging, how she was actually running late for work and needed to get going. All perfectly reasonable explanations, except for the fact that she'd never mentioned being in a hurry until I'd asked about the ring. After Madison left, I forced myself to go through Laura's jewelry box systematically, something I'd been avoiding because the emotional weight was too much to handle. That's when I confirmed my worst suspicions. Laura's engagement ring was definitely missing along with several other pieces, including her grandmother's necklace and the pearl earrings I'd given her for our 5th anniversary. If Madison had Laura's engagement ring, and if that ring had disappeared 3 months before Laura died, then Madison had been in our bedroom stealing jewelry while my wife was still alive and fighting for her health. The violation of that was almost incomprehensible. Laura had been so vulnerable during those final months, worried about being a burden, afraid of dying alone while I was at work. The thought that someone had been victimizing her during her most frightening and painful time made me want to break things. But I needed to think strategically, not emotionally. If Madison was involved in this conspiracy, then I'd been trusting the enemy with my deepest grief and most private thoughts for 8 months. I decided to test Madison's story about knowing Laura before her death. During her next visit, I casually mentioned some fake details about Laura's final weeks. Made up a story about her wanting to redecorate the bedroom, claimed she'd been talking about taking a trip to see her college roommate in Montana, said she'd been worried about a non-existent heart medication. Madison nodded along sympathetically to every single lie, even adding her own details about how Laura had mentioned those concerns to her. Either Madison had a very active imagination or she'd never actually had personal conversations with my dying wife. That evening, something happened that changed everything. Erin returned to my cabin. But this time, she wasn't alone. And she wasn't trying to be sneaky about it. She arrived with professional lighting equipment, multiple cameras, and what looked like a full production crew. She was treating my home like a studio, and her confidence was absolutely chilling. But instead of just live streaming her usual property security education content, she was filming something different, something that looked like a collaboration. I watched from my hidden position as Erin set up an elaborate scene in my living room, wearing Laura's wedding dress and surrounded by my wife's personal belongings. But the truly shocking part was when Madison arrived and joined the production. Not as a concerned neighbor or innocent bystander, but as a co-host. They worked together with obvious familiarity, setting up shots and discussing camera angles like they'd done this many times before. "Welcome back to Property Security Education," Erin said to her phone as thousands of viewers tuned in. "Tonight we have a very special episode featuring my colleague Madison, who's going to share some insights about the psychological vulnerabilities that make homeowners easy targets for property invasion." And Madison stepped into frame completely comfortable and obviously experienced with being on camera. She began discussing emotional manipulation techniques that criminals use to gain access to vulnerable properties and behavioral warning signs that indicate a homeowner is struggling with property management. The irony was sickening. Madison was literally teaching Erin's audience how to exploit grieving people while standing in my living room, surrounded by my dead wife's belongings, wearing stolen jewelry. She talked about identifying recently bereaved property owners through obituary monitoring and approaching targets during their most vulnerable emotional periods. She was giving a master class in psychological predation while describing exactly what she'd done to me. But the absolute worst part came when Madison started talking about long-term manipulation strategies for maintaining access to target properties. She described how to build emotional dependency in grieving victims, how to position yourself as their primary source of support, and how to gradually isolate them from other relationships that might interfere with the exploitation. "The key is becoming indispensable during their darkest moments," she explained to the camera. "You make them believe you're the only person who truly understands their pain, and then they'll do anything to keep you in their life." As I watched this horrific collaboration unfold, I realized that Madison hadn't just been helping Erin exploit my property. She'd been the architect of my psychological manipulation from the very beginning. Every coffee delivery, every supportive conversation, every perfectly timed visit during my lowest moments had been calculated moves in a larger strategy to keep me vulnerable and isolated while they systematically violated Laura's memory. The hidden camera captured one final detail that confirmed my worst fears. As they wrapped up their collaborative live stream, Madison casually mentioned that she'd been managing this target for 8 months and that the emotional dependency protocols had exceeded expectations. She wasn't talking about some abstract case study. She was talking about me. I'd been their experimental subject. They're a proof of concept for psychological manipulation techniques they were teaching to thousands of other predators. As I watched Madison comfort me while I cried, I noticed something that froze the very marrow in my bones. She was wearing Laura's missing engagement ring, the one that disappeared from our bedroom 3 months before Laura died. Drop a comment if you've ever had that gut feeling that someone close to you wasn't who they claimed to be. Because what I discovered next would have saved my wife's life if I had trusted my instincts sooner. The next few days turned into the most psychologically exhausting period of my entire life. I had to wake up every morning and pretend to be the same trusting, broken widower I'd been for 8 months while secretly investigating a conspiracy that included the woman I'd been depending on for emotional support. Every conversation with Madison became a performance where one wrong facial expression could expose that I knew the truth and destroy my only chance of getting real justice for Laura. I started by conducting what I called trust verification tests, feeding Madison specific pieces of false information to see if they would show up in Erin's operations. I told Madison I was worried about money problems that didn't exist, mentioned fictional conflicts with Laura's family, and even created a fake story about considering selling the cabin and moving back to Denver. Within 24 hours of each conversation, those exact details appeared in Erin's live stream content as examples of psychological vulnerability indicators that make homeowners easy targets for property exploitation. The coordination between them was flawless and terrifying. Madison would visit me for what seemed like genuine emotional support sessions, asking caring questions about how I was processing my grief and what challenges I was facing. But I started noticing that her questions weren't random. They were systematically gathering intelligence about my financial situation, my social connections, my travel plans, and my emotional state. She was conducting professional-level psychological profiling disguised as friendship. But Madison's manipulation went deeper than just conversation. During one of my trust tests, I deliberately left my laptop open to fake emails about selling the cabin, then went to the bathroom to see what she'd do. When I came back, the laptop was in exactly the same position, but the browser history showed she'd accessed my email account, my bank records, and even my phone's message history. Madison had been systematically violating my privacy for months, gathering intelligence about every aspect of my life while pretending to respect my boundaries. The audio surveillance devices I discovered were just the beginning. Madison had turned my entire cabin into an intelligence-gathering operation. She'd planted tracking devices in my truck, installed keyloggers on my computer, and even hidden cameras in my bedroom that were designed to monitor my sleep patterns and emotional breakdowns. She knew when I cried myself to sleep, when I had nightmares about Laura, when I talked to her photo during my lowest moments. She'd been treating my grief like a research project, documenting my psychological deterioration for analysis and exploitation. Meanwhile, Erin had escalated her counter-surveillance operations to a level that was genuinely impressive from a technical standpoint. Every morning at 8 o'clock sharp, she'd arrive with increasingly sophisticated equipment, military-grade radio frequency detectors, thermal imaging cameras, digital signal analyzers, and electronic warfare devices that could jam any wireless transmission within a half-mile radius. She wasn't just looking for cameras anymore. She was conducting systematic electronic warfare against my property. What made Erin's operations even more disturbing was how she turned them into educational content for her growing audience. She'd live stream her security sweeps to her 45,000 followers, explaining each piece of equipment and demonstrating how to detect hidden surveillance devices. Today, we're learning about thermal signature analysis, she'd announced while scanning my cabin with military equipment. This device can detect the heat signature from electronic components, even when they're hidden inside walls or disguised as household items. Her followers were getting graduate-level training in counter-surveillance techniques while thinking they were learning home security. The comments during these live streams were filled with people asking specific questions about defeating various types of cameras, avoiding motion sensors, and identifying wireless transmission devices. Erin was essentially running a criminal university, teaching thousands of people how to conduct professional-level breaking and entering while maintaining plausible deniability by framing it as property protection education. The systematic destruction of my security system was methodical and complete. Within 10 days, Erin had located and disabled 6 of my 7 cameras using techniques that would have impressed military intelligence specialists. She'd use radio frequency detection to find wireless devices, thermal imaging to locate power sources, and signal analysis to identify transmission patterns. Each camera she found became a teaching moment for her audience about common homeowner security mistakes that create vulnerabilities. But Erin's professional expertise created a blind spot that saved my investigation. She was so focused on detecting sophisticated electronic surveillance that she never considered that someone might use old-school hardwired solutions. The smoke detector camera didn't emit any radio frequencies, didn't generate unusual heat signatures, and didn't transmit data wirelessly. It was just a modified safety device that recorded everything to internal storage, completely invisible to all her advanced detection methods. What really got to me was watching Madison's psychological manipulation techniques in action. She'd arrive at my cabin with perfectly timed emotional support, always knowing exactly when I was struggling most. But I realized she wasn't psychic. She was listening to my private conversations through the audio devices she'd planted. She'd hear me crying or talking to Laura's photo, then show up 20 minutes later with coffee and comfort, pretending it was coincidental timing. Madison's expertise in psychological manipulation was genuinely sophisticated. She'd studied grief counseling techniques, trauma psychology, and behavioral analysis to better exploit vulnerable people. During our conversations, she'd use specific therapeutic language patterns to build emotional dependency while gathering intelligence about my mental state. She'd validate my feelings to build trust, then subtly guide conversations toward topics that served her information-gathering needs. The most chilling discovery was understanding how Madison had been manipulating my social connections. She had systematically isolated me from Laura's family and friends by providing updates about my emotional state that made me seem more fragile and unavailable than I actually was. When Laura's sister called to check on me, Madison would intercept the call and explain that I was having a particularly difficult day and might benefit from some space to process. She'd been gatekeeping my relationships, ensuring that I remained dependent on her as my primary source of emotional support. Officer Delgado's involvement was more extensive than I'd initially understood. He wasn't just ignoring their crimes for social media fame. He was actively facilitating their operation by providing law enforcement intelligence and suppressing victim reports. During one of Aaron's educational live streams, Torres appeared as a guest expert discussing managing victim credibility and leveraging law enforcement authority to discourage frivolous complaints. He was literally teaching criminals how to use police authority to intimidate victims. Torres had been receiving $2,000 per month for 18 months, and the services he provided went far beyond looking the other way. He'd coach them on avoiding criminal charges, help them identify corrupt officials in neighboring jurisdictions, and provide training on exploiting legal loopholes that made their scams difficult to prosecute. He'd even helped them develop victim psychological profiles based on police report patterns, identifying people who were less likely to be believed or taken seriously by law enforcement. But the detail that made me realize I was dealing with professional criminals rather than opportunistic scammers was discovering their victim selection methodology. Madison maintained detailed files on dozens of potential targets throughout the mountain community, complete with financial information, psychological profiles, family relationship analysis, and planned approach strategies. She had identified vulnerable populations, recent widows, elderly people dealing with health crisis, families struggling with unemployment, and anyone going through major life transitions that created emotional and financial vulnerability. The coffee shop served as more than just Madison's cover story. It was an intelligence-gathering hub where she'd engage community members in seemingly supportive conversations while quietly documenting their vulnerabilities. She'd remember details about customers' personal lives, follow up on their problems with apparent concern, and gradually build psychological profiles that determined whether they were suitable targets for exploitation. Every kind conversation was actually a screening interview for potential victimization. I decided to conduct my own counterintelligence operation to gather evidence about their broader network. I started visiting Madison's coffee shop regularly, sitting in different locations where I could observe her interactions with other customers. What I witnessed was systematic predatory behavior disguised as community caring. Madison would engage elderly customers in conversations about their health problems, recently divorced people about their financial struggles, and grieving families about their emotional challenges. She was farming the entire community for victims. The breaking point came when I discovered audio recordings that Madison had made of Laura during her final weeks. Madison had been visiting our cabin for months before Laura died, posing as a healthcare outreach worker, a grief counselor, and even a neighbor offering help with household tasks. Laura had been too sick and trusting to question these intrusions, and I'd been too focused on work and caregiving to notice the pattern of unknown visitors who seemed to know intimate details about our situation. But Madison hadn't just been gathering intelligence during those pre-death visits. She'd been actively interfering with Laura's medical care. The recordings revealed that Madison had convinced Laura to change her medication routine, suggesting natural supplements that would help with her energy levels and reduce the burden on her heart. Those supplements contained compounds that interfered with Laura's prescribed heart medication, creating the cardiac complications that led to her death. The audio evidence was devastating and crystal clear. I could hear Laura's voice, weak and trusting, thanking Madison for caring enough to research alternative treatments. I could hear Madison's voice, confident and manipulative, explaining why the supplements would be more effective than harsh pharmaceutical treatments that just mask symptoms instead of addressing root causes. She was literally talking my dying wife into taking poison while positioning herself as a caring friend who wanted to help. Laura's death hadn't been a natural progression of her illness. It had been murder carried out by someone who spent months gaining her trust and exploiting her desire to reduce the burden of her care on me. Madison had killed my wife not just to access our property, but to create the specific type of traumatic grief that would make me maximally vulnerable to psychological manipulation. She had engineered my emotional state to serve her criminal enterprise. The final piece of evidence I needed came from Madison's own surveillance equipment. Her audio devices had recorded not just my private conversations, but her own phone calls where she discussed my psychological profile with Aaron and Torres. I listened to hours of clinical analysis where Madison described my attachment patterns, my grief processing timeline, my social isolation indicators, and my trust rebuilding mechanisms. She talked about me like I was a laboratory animal, discussing which manipulation techniques were most effective and how to maintain emotional dependency over extended periods. But I was done being their victim. I'd learned their methods, documented their crimes, and gathered evidence that would destroy their entire operation. It was time to stop defending and start attacking. I began planning what I called Operation Laura's Justice, a comprehensive counteroffensive that would expose not just the property theft and psychological manipulation, but the systematic murder that had started it all. I told Madison I was planning to take her advice about getting away for healing time, showing her fake confirmation emails for a grief counseling retreat in Arizona. "You're so right about needing space to process everything," I growled through clenched teeth, watching her face carefully for tells. "I think being away from all the memories here will help me start moving forward." Madison's enthusiasm was immediate and intense. She practically pushed me toward taking the trip, offering to watch the property and asking detailed questions about my departure timeline. What Madison didn't know was that I'd installed a new generation of surveillance equipment that was completely undetectable by their methods. I'd used my IT security background to create a hardwired recording system that would capture everything they did when they thought I was gone. The cameras were built into structural elements of the house itself, powered by the electrical system, and designed to record everything to multiple backup storage systems that couldn't be jammed, detected, or destroyed. The hidden camera captured their entire victory macabre triumph. But what Madison whispered to Aaron at the end of that recording, it wasn't about money or property or even revenge. It was about something they did to Laura that I never knew happened. I'm not going to lie, discovering that Madison had murdered my wife nearly broke me completely. For about 48 hours, I sat in my cabin staring at the evidence, trying to process the fact that the woman I had trusted to help me grieve had actually caused the grief in the first place. But then something shifted inside me. Something cold and determined that Laura would have recognized. She always said that when I got truly angry, not frustrated or annoyed, but righteously furious, I became capable of things that surprised even me. So, I did something that Madison and Aaron never expected from their carefully manipulated victim. I got strategic. I spent 3 days meticulously organizing 48 hours of recorded damning revelations, financial records, victim testimonies, and evidence of systematic murder and fraud into a comprehensive documentary that would destroy their entire operation. But I wasn't going to just hand this over to law enforcement. I was going to make sure the whole world knew exactly what these predators had done to vulnerable families. The final piece of evidence I needed came when I told Madison I was planning to take her advice about getting away for healing time. I created fake confirmation emails for a grief counseling retreat in Arizona and showed them to her during one of our coffee sessions. "You're so right about needing space to process everything." I told her I think being away from all the memories here will help me start moving forward. Madison's enthusiasm was immediate and intense. She practically pushed me toward the door, offering to watch the property while I was gone and asking detailed questions about my departure timeline. What Madison didn't know was that I'd installed a new generation of surveillance equipment that was completely undetectable by their methods. These weren't wireless cameras that could be jammed or consumer electronics that could be spotted with ERF detectors. I'd used my IT security background to create a hardwired recording system that functioned like the black box on an airplane designed to capture everything and survive any attempt to destroy the evidence. The morning I was supposed to leave for my fake retreat, I packed my truck with obvious luggage, made a show of checking out of my cabin, and drove down the mountain like I was heading for the interstate. But instead of going to Arizona, I parked at a trailhead about 5 miles away and hiked back through the forest to a concealed position where I could observe my property while maintaining remote access to all my recording equipment through a cellular connection that their signal jammers couldn't block. What I witnessed over the next 72 hours was the most comprehensive damning revelation to multiple felonies I've ever seen outside of a courtroom. Madison and Aaron thought they had complete privacy, no surveillance, and no chance of being caught. They celebrated their success with Laura's anniversary champagne, the bottle she and I had been saving for our 10th wedding anniversary, while conducting what they called a post-operation debrief that documented their entire criminal enters. The macabre triumph started within 2 hours of my fake departure and continued for 3 days. Madison, Aaron, Tories, and 2 other people I had never seen before treated my cabin like their personal party venue while discussing not just my case, but 17 other similar operations they'd conducted over the past 3 years. They had photographs of victims, financial records showing profits totaling over $400,000, detailed psychological profiles of targets throughout Colorado and neighboring states, and expansion plans for taking their operation nationwide. The most damaging evidence came when Madison described her role as what she called the emotional management specialist. She explained to the group how she'd identified me as a target within days of Laura's death, using obituary information, social media monitoring and healthcare data breaches to find recently bereaved property owners who fit their victim profile. Tim was perfect, she said, raising a toast with Laura's champagne. Isolated, overwhelmed, desperate for human connection and completely trusting. The psychological dependency protocols worked exactly as designed. But the detail that froze the very marrow in my bones was Madison's casual admission about Laura's death. The medication interaction wasn't accidental. She laughed like she was discussing the weather. When you know someone's prescription schedule and you have access to their daily pill organizer, it's remarkably easy to create cardiac complications that look like natural disease progression. Tim never suspected anything because he was so focused on being the perfect caregiver. Sometimes you have to accelerate the timeline to optimize the emotional vulnerability window. My wife had been murdered to make me a better victim. Madison had killed Laura, not just for the property, but to ensure I'd be devastated enough to accept manipulation without question. The supplements Madison had recommended to Laura contained compounds that interfered with her heart medication, creating the fatal cardiac episode that I'd been blaming myself for not preventing. I'd spent 8 months thinking I'd somehow failed to save my wife, when the truth was that the woman comforting me through that guilt had been her killer. I recorded everything, every damning revelation, every detail about their methods, every piece of evidence about their network of victims. Then I spent 12 hours editing the footage into a coherent narrative that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. The final video was 2 hours long, meticulously documented, and devastating in its completeness. I titled it simply, "How Grief Predators Murdered My Wife and Taught Me to Trust My Killer." I uploaded the documentary to every social media platform simultaneously at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, knowing that the timing would maximize viral spread as people shared content throughout their workday. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 6 hours, the video had been viewed over 5 million times across all platforms. The comments were filled with outrage, horror, and demands for justice that went far beyond anything I'd expected. But what really amplified the impact was when other victims started coming forward. The video had inspired dozens of people to share their own stories of being targeted by similar schemes, creating a wave of victim testimonies that demonstrated this wasn't an isolated incident, but a widespread criminal enterprise. People posted warnings about predatory behavior in their own communities, shared resources for protecting vulnerable family members, and organized support networks for other victims. The hashtag Grief Predators started trending nationally within 12 hours, and mainstream news outlets began covering the story with an intensity that surprised even me. The combination of murder, psychological manipulation, law enforcement corruption, and systematic exploitation of grieving families created a perfect storm of public outrage that made the story impossible to ignore. Cable news channels ran segments about predatory targeting of vulnerable populations. Newspapers published investigations into similar scams in other states, and social media Influencers with millions of followers shared the video with their audiences. By the end of the first week, Madison's coffee shop was permanently closed, surrounded by protesters demanding justice. Erin's social media accounts were suspended for promoting criminal activity, and her 45,000 followers had turned into a mob calling for her arrest. Torres was suspended from duty pending investigation, and 3 other law enforcement officers in neighboring jurisdictions were revealed to have similar corruption arrangements with the network. The legal consequences came swiftly but thoroughly. Federal investigators took over the case within days, treating it as an organized criminal enterprise rather than a local property dispute. Madison was arrested at her coffee shop and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, fraud, and operating a criminal organization. Erin faced similar charges, plus additional counts related to her live stream operations and property theft. Torres was charged with corruption, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and accessory to murder for helping cover up their crimes. All 3 were denied bail as flight risks after investigators discovered they'd been planning to relocate their operation to Arizona, where they'd already begun targeting military families dealing with deployment-related stress and trauma. The scope of their planned expansion was terrifying. They had identified vulnerable populations in 12 states and had begun recruiting local accomplices to replicate their model of grief exploitation. But the real justice came from the community response. My neighbors organized a complete restoration of the cabin, bringing it back to exactly how Laura and I had decorated it originally. They created a memorial garden where we placed Laura's recovered ashes. Yes, we found them in the landfill, exactly where the video evidence showed Erin had disposed of them. Over 100 volunteers spent 3 days systematically searching until we recovered about 70% of Laura's remains, enough to give her the respectful final resting place she deserved. The memorial garden became something larger than just a place for my healing. Other victims of the network came to honor their own lost family members, and we created a space where people could process the unique trauma of having their grief exploited by predators. Support groups formed, resources were shared, and genuine healing began to happen in a way that honored the memory of everyone who had been victimized by this network. The legal resolution took 6 months, but it was thorough. Madison received life in prison without parole for first-degree murder, plus additional consecutive sentences for fraud and conspiracy. Erin got 25 years of federal prison, plus lifetime restitution payments to victims. Torres lost his pension, his law enforcement certification, and received 12 years in prison, plus a permanent prohibition from working in any government capacity. 17 other network members across 6 states were arrested and convicted as the investigation expanded. Most importantly, the case led to significant legislative changes that made it harder for predators to exploit grieving families. New laws requiring verification of property management companies, enhanced penalties for targeting bereaved victims, mandatory reporting systems for suspicious death-related business activities, and federal oversight of law enforcement responses to victim complaints. Laura's memory had been violated, but her death ultimately led to protections that would help other families avoid similar exploitation. The financial recovery was substantial, too. Asset forfeit from the criminal network, combined with civil judgments and restitution orders, provided compensation not just for property theft, but for the psychological trauma of having grief systematically exploited. I donated most of my settlement to organizations that help victims of elder abuse and predatory targeting, keeping only enough to ensure the memorial garden would be maintained in perpetuity. 6 months after the convictions, I was finally starting to feel like myself again when I received a call from a detective in Arizona. Military families near a base outside Phoenix were being targeted by what looked like a copycat operation using the same psychological manipulation techniques that had been used against me. The detective had seen news coverage of our case and wondered if I might be willing to consult on their investigation. Justice was served, my wife's ashes were recovered, and all 3 primary conspirators were behind bars. But 6 months later, when I got that call from Arizona about military families being targeted, the voice on the other end said something that changed everything. Mr. Scott, we found Laura's medical records in our suspects' files. That's where we'll end today's story here on Echo Stories. Should Tim investigate what really happened to Laura, or are some truths better left buried? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback helps determine which stories get a part 2. If this case shocked you as much as it shocked me, hit that like button and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay safe out.